I'm always delighted to address budding historians. I see many of you here. I'm not going to give any lecture or sermon on the topic which I have given for the talk. It's just an attempt to share what I have been researching, writing and discussing with all budding historians in JNU and other places. And particularly I thank my friend Pratik for organizing such a wonderful, meaningful and the much needed discussion, because it is something which is needed not because we are desperately looking for rewriting history, but because there is a need to rethink the alternatives that we are not aware, or we are not told, or we are completely ignorant for various reasons. So the topic Nation and Nationalism, Decoding K.M. Panikkar. He is a very interesting individual. He was actually from Kerala and did his studies at Oxford, and particularly after First World War, he was shaped by anti-colonial movement worldwide, and he was also influenced by the pan-Indian sentimentalism that was expressed, particularly in Europe and Oxford. Now, what I am trying to share is not something very complex, just a simple idea how history, politics, nation and nationalism can be understood as an intricately interconnected phenomenon. When I say intricately interconnected phenomenon, as student of history, we all know what is history. History is a continuous process of interaction between past and present, and it is an unending dialogue between historians and our facts. And what do we mean by the term politics? Politics, as I understand, is a method of articulating ideas to achieve an intended objective or set of objectives that can be used for the welfare of either state or society or nation. Now it is in this context, what do we mean by the term nation? I'm sure there are various definitions, many books have been written, various scholars talk about various ideas about nation. And my understanding of nation is maybe it can be a social or cultural construct or civilisational construct, and based on which you have a culturally vibrant commonality which continue to exist in India, which is why even Nehru is talking about what was the one factor that was able to unite India despite the fact that India was witnessing series of invasions, violence, bloodshed and so on and so forth. When he says it is nothing but cultural commonality. One has to therefore seriously think about what exactly cultural commonality is all about. And second, of course, when you read K.M. Panikkar, you also find that nation is nothing, it's not merely a political construct, it is a geo-cultural, civilisational and spiritual. Now you might find some of you, what is geo-cultural, what is civilisational, what is spiritual? I am using two important phrases to use spiritualism, to make sense of spiritualism. So nationalism for me can be understood in two ways. One is, if you really think that it is geo-cultural, maybe you can think of the idea of motherland, Matrubhumi. Right? It's not something which is not 18th century or 19th century, as a section of historians would often talk about nation and nationalism only in the 18th, 19th century, as if the French Revolution is the ideal model to be followed to construct the idea of nation or nationalism, which may not be the case with India. So geo-cultural sense of the term therefore can be restricted to the idea of motherland. You call it motherland or fatherland or sacred land or holy land. I have no problem with it. But there is something called motherland, which often we trace the roots back to the ancient literature. And what do I mean by spiritualism? Spiritualism here, the term which we are all familiar, but we often hesitant to use the term. Maybe because of various reasons. We are not told exactly why this, or we are trying to be apologetic about why there is a need to talk about, because we think that doesn't make sense. For me, I trace the foundation of nation and nationalism to the very important idea which we are all familiar with, which is nothing but Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. For me, it is nothing but the spiritual realm, which is not just meant for a territorial nationality, but it also can be used in the larger context. Now tell me one example where any country is talking about the world is one family, one civilization, one country or one nation. Where do we find any idea such Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam of the world is family, one family? So there may be different forms of expressions, but this is very explicit reference how spiritualism can bind people of different sections, different religious traditions, different identities. So the point which I am emphasizing here is the spiritualism which is constructed on the premise of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a very important method of understanding. So therefore I would always emphasize the idea, if politics is a method of articulating ideas of empowerment to achieve certain intended objectives, nationalism can be used as a methodology. So politics is a method and nationalism can be used as a methodology. So I am using K.M. Panikkar in this context, how he was trying to understand both nationalism and nation or politics. Politics as a method, nationalism as a methodology. So when I say nationalism, how do we define? There are many definitions about nationalism. My definition is very simple. Idealism in politics is nationalism. Idealism in politics. So that idealism can be traced back to spiritualism. So this spiritualism has its power in the premise, which I would call, which everybody calls it, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So politics as a method, nationalism as a methodology, this nationalism which believes certain form of idealism. So this idealism is deeply rooted in the context of spiritualism. This spiritualism is deeply embedded in the broader, inclusive, democratic idea called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, for those who construct this idea of nationalism on the premise of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, as I also admire this school of thought, Indian nationalism is perhaps the only nationalism of its kind in the entire world that has envisioned what I would call a transnational identity, simply because it seeks to transcend its own geo-cultural identity. As I already discussed about the geo-cultural aspect, of nationalism can be understood through the broader category of motherland, but the spiritual component of nationalism can be understood through Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So now you have both the aspects. One is the geo-cultural and the second one is the spiritual component. Now the question comes, where is the political aspect of it? So the political aspect also is equally important, because otherwise we don't be able to study how the ancient Mauryas and the Guptas and the Cholas, the Sangam period, and of course the early medieval period, early modern and modern. So I am not completely negating or undermining the political construct also, but what is more powerful in the Indian context is not or may not be political. Because this is the reason why a section of historians always say nation and nationalism is an 18th century construct or 19th century construct. For my understanding, since we have already powerful way of understanding, explaining, experiencing the form of nation and nationalism in these two important categories, geo-cultural component, where you have the idea of motherland, and the spiritual aspect of it, where you have Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So now, for me, there is no need to make a comparison between Indian nationalism and European nationalism. So what is nationalism, therefore, in Europe may not be a nationalism in India. So what is nation? I am not using nation and nationalism, I am using, as Professor said, Rashtra. I am using the vernacularization of nationalism. When the English word is used to refer to nation and nationalism, I am vernacularizing the English form of nationalism, which is, for me, Rashtra and Rashtratva. Rashtra and Rashtratva. Nation and nationalism. So the point which is very important, therefore, of course, people might ask, those who are critical about the way you are explaining the geo-cultural aspect and the spiritual aspect. People might, I have a discussion with some of the critics who would say, oh, Christu, you are really romanticizing the past. And you are talking exceptionally about the civilisational exceptionalism. And they also discuss something that you are trying to give much importance to, civilisational self-congratulations. I have no problem with it. You can come out with various ideas. But the truth is, there cannot be any compromise. There cannot be any way that we can do away with these categories, because the idea of nation and nationalism is as old as the civilization, the cultural idea of India itself. Now finally, I'll just take one important aspect. I'd like just ask questions also. It is in this context I suggest all the budding historians who are in the making, who will definitely be historians maybe at CHS or Delhi University or various parts of India, my suggestion is always ask critical questions. Always try to transcend the binaries and boundaries. Don't restrict yourself with the existing historiography. So as a student of history, I always ask, particularly when I analyze K.M. Panikar, is nationalism an 18th and 19th century phenomenon? The question, is nationalism an 18th and 19th century phenomenon? There may be people who would be trying to convince us, yes, it is 18th century because French Revolution happened, Industrial Revolution happened, American Revolution happened. You don't have to have a revolution to understand as a model of nation and nationalism. That is not Indian nationalism. Because India hardly had any history of such revolution except 1857. India hardly had any bloodshed, violence, hatred in the name of religion. So how this European model of nation and nationalism can be a model, perfect model? There's nothing perfect in that sense. There's no gospel truth in terms of nation nationalism. So Western model, I'm sorry to say, may not be a perfect model, and those who use the Western model of the 18th and 19th century of nation and nationalism are simply imposing their ideas. It is in this context I would be very critical, and using these two terms, the history writing about nation and nationalism is an academic rivalry between two schools of thought. One is those who propose the factualization of history, and the second is, in the name of secularization of history, facts are consciously overlooked. You can go back to Indus Valley civilization when the factualization of history talks about that there is an example for priestly-like structure. You find another school of thought which often claim themselves to be secularization of school of thought, or secularization of history. No, it has nothing to do with the priestly class. It doesn't have to be, because it is an attempt to secularize history whereby you are undermining the reality of history. There could be various other examples. The construction of caste is another example. The Portuguese constructed the term. The caste itself is the Portuguese term. But how we are now thinking always in terms of the secularization of history. This is another example. Another example is feudalism. India had a history of feudalism, like the way in the West. This is also another attempt of imposing the westernization of Indian history writing. I can give you a lot of examples. Due to time constraint, I stop here, because when you read history, write history, I'm just talking to young minds, the historians of tomorrow, always ask the question, are we really on the side of secularization of history? In the name of secularization of history, the actual essence might be missed. When we are on the side of factualization of history, it is nothing but an intellectual process. Factualization doesn't need to be invoked the spirit of politics and ideology. The factualization of history only requires how far we are striving to explore the truth, the facts. It's a cognitive exercise. It's a cognitive process. This is what I'm developing this theory, how the secularization of history in the name of interpretation, consciously overlooking the facts, sometimes misinterpret facts, sometimes mislead the readers that this was actually the reality. But this may not be the reality. When you look at history from factualization, which is a cognitive process which doesn't have to comply with any political pressure or political ideology, and thereby the only objective or objectives before as historians is to explore the reality. But on the contrary, in the name of secularization of history, everyone is branded fascist, communal, totalitarian, but the real history may not be so. So let us be aware of such writing of history, and let us try which side of the history you are standing, whether secularization of history or factualization of history. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful presentation. Now we move to the academic paper presentation.